Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's good to see everyone. I'm going to be offering, for the bulk of the next hour, kind of a fast and loose survey of the history of film music, but it'll be leavened by my own personal observations and experiences. So I have a lot to get to in 45 minutes or so we'll get started right away. I think we're all familiar with that. The first time I experienced that in a theater was in 1977. I had heard it before, I'd seen it before. You know, I was a big old movie buff even as a kid. I was 10 years old, and this comes on the screen. I think, what is it? You know, is this an old movie? What am I doing here? It had fallen out of circulation. I'll tell you a little more about that. But after this, of course, there was kind of a preamble for the movie. And the words come up, once upon a time, or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And everybody knows what that led to. There's that moment of silence, but it's a setup. And in a moment, I was just blown back in my seat. And so that was really my first experience with the 20th Century Fox logo in a theater. And this was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was overwhelming. The experience of just being overwhelmed by the music for one thing, but also the special effects, of course, at the beginning, the sound design, the memorable characters, and for a 10-year-old in 1977, it was pretty heady stuff. It was world building. You had it was all fresh and yet somehow familiar. Even as a 10-year-old, I'd watched a lot of television, just like, George Lucas liked old movies. He was a film buff. So Star Wars was really a seminal experience. As I got older, I realized, well, this is taking from the Western, it's taking from the swashbuckler, it's taking from the samurai film. There are all sorts of influences for the movie. So everything old is new again. And so the 20th Century Fox fanfare, of course, suits the film completely. And George Lucas is the one who lobbied to have that put in there, because at that point, 20th Century Fox had been kind of phasing it out. It had been used a lot in the movies going back to the 1930s. And of course, the music was by John Williams. I don't have to tell you that. Yeah, and I'm not even going to play an excerpt from it because everybody knows the music for Star Wars. The fanfare was written by Alfred Newman in 1933. And Alfred Newman was also one of the great film composers of Hollywood's golden age. He was music director at 20th Century Fox for 20 years, but he had about 40 years experience writing film scores, and he's very prolific. He did the music for just among the dozens of scores that he did, hundreds probably. He did Wuthering Heights, he did, Prisoner of Zenda, he did All About Eve, he did The Robe, Captain from Castile, just so many classic films. And his last film was Airport in 1970. But, and he's part of one of the progenitors of the Newman dynasty. His brothers were all in the business. Emil Newman and Lionel Newman was a music director. And his other brother was an agent who wound up managing John Williams and all these other film composers. He had two sons. We have Thomas Newman and David Newman, who are also prominent film composers working today. And in turn, there's a third generation, but I'm not familiar with that fellow's music. Alfred Newman won 9 Academy Awards and had 45 nominations. He held the record for many years. John Williams surpassed him a few years ago with 54 nominations, although he only has 5 Academy Awards. John Williams, after Walt Disney, is the most nominated person. He is the most nominated person alive, but after Walt Disney, he's the most nominated person ever. Disney was nominated 59 times, and John Williams was nominated 54 times. So prior to Star Wars, for me, music was kind of incidental. It's not the first time I noticed music in the movies. But Star Wars changed everything, both culturally, as you know, but also for me personally. And I begged for the soundtrack album. And as you see, I got it. That's the original album I got in 1977. I begged my parents for it. And they kept hedging. We would be in Woolworths or at Two Guys or something, and I'd get a knockoff recording because it was less expensive. So I would get, an orchestra with no conductor listed, or I get the Miko's Star Wars and Other Galactic Funk. I even had a Moog cover of the score, a whole album done on the Moog of Star Wars, and I still have it. But finally they broke down. I got the album, and it became kind of my fantasy world. I mean, like every 10-year-old at that point, we were obsessed with Star Wars. But I did all of my writing. I did all of my drawing. We started making films before we were even teenagers, all inspired by the soundtrack album by Star Wars. And it developed my passion for music. I would sometimes just lie on my bed and just look at the album. It was back in the days when there was all kinds of artwork and there were all notes and things. And as I read these notes, I started to notice that there would be allusions made to other composers, and I started to check those out. So, it's not every kid in his early teens who goes to the library to look for Wagner operas. And as you see, it changed my life. And that's not the whole collection. But, a portion of it, off-screen, is film music. And I do have a number of shows, and I've done radio now for 40 years. So, but even before Star Wars, though, I was a big old movie guy. This is before the cable explosion, the 1970s. You remember, you would come home and, well, maybe some of you don't, but you'd come home from school and it'd be a Bogart movie on or a Bette Davis film. And even before I was even in school, I was fascinated with the monster movies. It's funny to think about now when we have such an embarrassment of options that, we were still entertained by these movies that were 40 years old in the early 70s. I mean, all of my friends were crazy for monsters. We all loved the Universal horror movies, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. And, then I discovered the Marx Brothers. And so, here we are in the 70s, and we're worshiping all this stuff from the 1930s. And, these are some of my favorites from before Star Wars. King Kong, was the music made such an impression. It was so grand and so tragic and so romantic. The Bride of Frankenstein, Max Steiner did King Kong. Franz Waxman did Bride of Frankenstein, and it was creepy, but also kind of funny and also thrilling. Adventures of Robin Hood. It's not a monster movie, but it got me going. And my friends and I would take down the curtain rods, and we'd start, doing the quarterstaff fight or whatever with Little John. But we remembered the music. We would actually be singing Korngold's music at like 12 years old. We knew this stuff. So the I already said, in 1970s, these things were just on TV. I watched the Saturday creature double features. My mother, before I was even in kindergarten, we would sit and watch the Chiller Theater on WPIX out of New York City, and they'd always have the old black and white monster movies. So I had a base for the music. So an awareness of film served kind of as an introduction to the orchestra. And that was very important to me. And that kind of helped me embrace classical music. Because mainly I'm a classical music guy, but I've always had an affection for film music. And I was able to work that into my programming and eventually start my own film music show in 2010 called Picture Perfect, hence the name of this talk. Not that film music and classical music are necessarily the same thing. I'm not going to go down. We're going to have a Q&A afterwards. If anybody wants me to talk about it, I'll talk about it. But that's a whole other subject. So I'm going to give you now a whirlwind tour of a history of music in the movies, classic Ross Amico style. And we begin in the silent era. Now, silent movies were never really silent. I'm sure you've heard that before. Even back in the 1890s when you had the Lumiere brothers and the guy who did Trip to the Moon, Voyage of the Journey to the Moon, Méliès. Thank you. They always had piano accompaniment or a Wurlitzer, or they'd have a group of musicians. And in fact, Méliès, I read, would fabricate some scores, short scores for his movies, but a lot of times in the silent era, these things were kind of pastiches or they were medleys where there would be popular classical overtures. They developed kind of a repertoire of things to fall back on. For chase scenes, you'd have a soupe overture, or you have a sentimental salon song for a tragic scene, or for the love scene they would play Liszt Liebesstrom or something. Things that people started to recognize, and they just kind of used these as background for silent movies. Well, things started to change because things developed very quickly, and in 1908, actually, Camille Saint-Saëns, who you probably know from Carnival of the Animals and the Organ Symphony and a number of other classical hits, he wrote a film score for a short. It was actually a long short, about 20 minutes long. It's called The Assassination of the Duke of Guise. It has nothing to do with waterfowl. It's like Guise, G-U-I-S-E. The Assassination of the Duke of Guise, and it had to do with, it was set during the time of the French wars on religion. It was the backdrop of Meyerbeer's opera, The Huguenots, and also Alexander Dumas' novel, Queen Margot, where they had the clashing between the Catholics and the Huguenots and what have you. But that's the theme of the film. And it's 20 minutes long. Saint-Saëns writes wall-to-wall music for it. It's not a pastiche. It's not, you don't hear any William Tell overture. You don't hear any of the stuff you might hear ordinarily in a Nickelodeon or something. It's, or in a silent, not a Nickelodeon, but a silent film presentation. So this is like sometimes credited as the first original film score, but there are varying opinions on this, various schools of thought. By the time we get to the 20s, people are writing full-length scores. In fact, even before that, there was Carl Breil, who's not really a familiar name, in 1915, but everybody probably knows the name of the film Birth of a Nation. And he wrote an original score for that. That does, however, draw very heavily on the classical repertoire with Wagner and other classical composers. But he does use leitmotif, which is a technique that Wagner is closely associated with, in which little snippets, little fragments of a melody are associated with different characters or ideas or objects or that sort of thing, and they're developed throughout the film. He kind of toys with this. It's kind of a rickety score, but it's an original score for a full-length epic film by D.W. Griffith. Metropolis, on the other hand, is a fabulous score. In 1927, this Gottfried Huppertz, who probably very few people know about, wrote this huge opulent Straussian score for this 2.5-hour proto-science fiction movie by Fritz Lang. And you may recognize the robot. Again, George Lucas got some ideas from his knowledge of films past, very C-3PO-like. But it was played by an orchestra at the film's premiere. And the score was reconstructed and it's been recorded. And I have heard it played with the organ on a number of occasions. If you buy the home video, it has the orchestral score on it. But I've heard it done at the Patriots Theater, and we heard it at, I think, down in Phoenixville with the organist, who was Brett Miller. I don't know if he just played at the Garden not too long ago. I think he did Metropolis at the Garden, as a matter of fact, but I missed it. Napoleon, 1927, just a few months later. This was Abel Gance's big epic. When it was released, it was 9 hours long. When I saw it in the 80s, when Francis Ford Coppola put up the money to have the thing, bless you, to have the thing restored, and they showed it in New York City with an orchestra. Carmine Coppola, Coppola's father, did the score for it. It was at 3 hours when I saw it. But they've got it back up now to about 7 hours. It was just re-premiered. They had another premiere. Every few years they do another Napoleon premiere, I think. So they got it up to 7 hours, and they did that in France in 2 sittings. Arthur Honegger was the original composer, and he's not really known. I shouldn't say he's not known as a film composer because he wrote a lot of film scores, but he's primarily remembered these days as a classical music composer. He wrote symphonies and symphonic poems and a big oratorio on Joan of Arc. So he's a reputable composer. In fact, Miklos Rozsa, the guy who wrote the music for Ben-Hur, was a struggling young Hungarian composer in Paris trying to write concert music, and he wanted to know. He asked Honegger how he made ends meet. And Oettinger said, well, I write film music. And that's how Roja got into films. He took Oettinger's advice to keep food on the table and went on to become one of our great film composers. Charlie Chaplin, a totally different perspective here because these guys were trained musicians. Charlie Chaplin was an intuitive musician. He was a star of the music hall before he got into the movies. He played he could pick out melodies on the violin, on the cello, so he kind of knew his way around those instruments, and he had a very good ear for melody. And he understood that his comedy could be, whoops, don't even look at that. We're not there yet. His comedy could be enhanced by kind of having a layer of sentimentality or pathos or kind of a more lyrical musical element to kind of counteract the shenanigans, the slapstick on stage. All right, so we get into the golden age of Hollywood now, and we have sound. And this guy was a giant in the sound era. I highly recommend this book. Stephen C. Smith came out a couple of years ago. It's an entertaining read. You'll learn a lot about Max Steiner, of course, but you also learn a lot about not only the golden age of Hollywood, but also Europe before Max came here. He was the son of Gabor Steiner, who was the guy who founded the amusement park in Vienna. It was called Venice in Vienna. It had the huge Ferris wheel that you might remember from The Third Man. His father was in on the construction of that. His grandfather was a friend of Johann Strauss the Younger and encouraged him to write some of his operettas like Die Fledermaus. But so Max comes from a pretty interesting lineage. He came to the United States. He started out, he went to London and worked on shows there, came to the United States, got involved with Broadway. He worked with the Gershwins. He worked with Jerome Kern. He was music director there, went out to Hollywood, and he basically forged the Hollywood sound. There were a couple of guys who did this, but Max Steiner is really the giant. He's the one that kind of brought that old world sound to the new world. When people listen to Strauss, when they listen to Mahler, and they say, this sounds like movie music, this is why. Because Max Steiner was Richard Strauss's godson. He knew Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler was a tutor of Max Steiner. So it's not like these guys were ripping off the sound for the movies. They actually brought it over in their DNA. Steiner's great hit, the big splash at the beginning of his career was King Kong, although the year before there's a score he wrote called Bird of Paradise, which is also wall-to-wall music, huge. Joel McRae, and I think Fay Wray's in it too. But anyway, this is the one that got the attention. It has the big monkey and the newly built Empire State Building, and again, the pathos. There's the terror of Kong, and there's the exotic origins, and then he comes to New York, all hell breaks loose. You've seen the movie, but it's really one of the first big Hollywood scores. And here's just a little bit from King Kong with the RKO logo. All right, so that's the opening credits of King Kong. These things kind of served as overtures for the movie. And so, of course, you had the portentous theme for Kong, and then there's a more romantic theme for his love for what's her name, Ann Darrow or whatever, Fay Wray's character in Kong. But anyway, this was really a big deal. He had a huge orchestra, and he wrote this thing, and it became hugely influential. And everybody wanted a sound like this in their films. He went over to Warner Brothers, and that's where he wrote his most of his greatest scores. There was another one that he did for Selznick, and I'm sure you probably recognize. Anyway, that's enough. I mean, that gives you an idea. It's not enough of Gone with the Wind by any means. It's just, for years, that just kind of defined the majesty of, the kind of the golden age of Hollywood. Steiner wrote 300 scores, some 300 scores. He was responsible for a lot of innovations. He was the first guy to use the click track, where the musicians had earpieces so they could kind of hear the beat and stay synchronized with the film when they were playing. He, controversially, he also kind of fell into moments of what's called Mickey Mousing, where he imitates the action on screen in the music. Like if somebody slams a door, there'll be a stinger, on the soundtrack, or if somebody trips, they make like a goofy thing in the clarinets or something like that. But by and large, he was one of the great film composers who brought that old world style to the new world. Erich Wolfgang Korngold was another one, even more respectable than, I should say not even, he was more respectable than Steiner. He's one of the great composers of his era. He was renowned for his operas, and Warner Brothers threw a lot of money at him to come to the United States and score films exclusively for them. He came over with Max Reinhardt, who was a Viennese impresario, for a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which first played at the Hollywood Bowl, and then they made a movie of it, I think in 1934. And he adapted the music of Mendelssohn, but he did all kinds of crazy things. He didn't just use the famous incidental music from Midsummer Night's Dream. He took some of Mendelssohn's piano pieces, he took some of the symphonies, he put choruses in it, and he did all kinds of stuff with it. Warner's loved it, even though the movie made no money. And they had him back to do Captain Blood in 1935, among other films. I mean, he would go back and forth to Europe because he had a great concert career there. But because of the political situation and the rise of fascism, a lot of these guys got stuck in the US. Either they outright fled or they got stuck here. In Korngold's case, he was very lucky because he was here, most of his family was here. And then when the Anschluss, it was in 1938, he said Robin Hood saved his life because basically there was like this colony of exiles who lived in California, these European artists and composers and everybody. They were all out working in Hollywood. This film was another, as I said, formative experience for me, Robin Hood. Great wall-to-wall, opulent score. He, at the age of, he started writing very young. Mahler declared him a genius. He was like 11 years old. He had a ballet performed before the emperor and in a command performance. He had a double bill of his operas performed at 18. He had his greatest successes in his early 20s in the concert world. And then he had a hard time getting back because time kind of passed him by. He wasn't modernist enough. He was very romantic in his language. I recommend exploring his music if you don't know it. This is the kind of music he wrote. I don't have any Robin Hood, but I'm just going to play the beginning of the Seahawk because it really exemplifies what made me fall in love with Erich Wolfgang. That's an idea of kind of the swagger of the Korngold's music, and then you get the wide open romance of the possibility of limitless adventure with the bee theme, and it's just like, as a teenager and what have you, it just totally grabbed me, and I collected everything I could, which was not much at the time. Now, I want to, maybe not a lot of people know this movie. It's on Turner Classic Movies fairly often, at least once a month probably. But when you listen to the opening of this, let me see if it reminds you of anything. All right. So anyway, very much the John Williams sound, is it not? And it was one of the principal inspirations for when he went to write the main title for Star Wars. King's Row. I recommend the movie if you've not seen it. It's a really interesting Warner Brothers melodrama. Dark film, not as dark as the book. Which is by Henry Bellman, who was one time music director or dean of the Curtis Institute of Music, by the way. But it's a very interesting film. King's Row, Erich Wolfgang Korngold. We're going to move on to one of the homegrown composers. These guys were all old world. One of the geniuses we produced here in the United States, Bernard Herrmann. Here he is with Alfred Hitchcock, goofing around here. He was Hitch's favorite collaborator, favorite film composer for a while. They eventually had an irreparable falling out. He also worked with Orson Welles. He was first with CBS Radio. He did the underscoring for a lot of radio dramas, including Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air. He was involved with the famous War of the Worlds radio broadcast with the Mercury Theater. When Welles was brought to Hollywood to do Citizen Kane, he came on his coattails and did the score for Citizen Kane, first film score, did The Magnificent Ambersons, his third film. Actually, was it the second film? The Devil and Daniel Webster, which was known as All That Money Can Buy back then, won him his only Academy Award. But anyway, he had a very unique way of handling the orchestra. At his greatest, I think, he would look up at a film and he says, well, this film requires, for instance, we have The Day the Earth Stood Still here from 1951 with Gort. And Klaatu. His score called for electric violin, cello, and bass, 2 theremins, 2 Hammond organs, a large studio electric organ, 3 vibraphones, 2 glockenspiels, 2 pianos, 2 harps, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, and 4 tubas. And in addition, he did all this unusual overdubbing and tape reversal on the score. So, but he worked with Ray Harryhausen, the great stop motion. He did that Dynamation process with the stop motion cyclopses and what's the plural of cyclops? Cyclopes? I don't know. Yeah, well, he did the things with the cyclops, and he did all kinds of crazy stuff. So he was always thinking of unusual ways to kind of marry the orchestra to the on-screen action. So here's just a little bit from The Day the Earth Stood Still. We won't listen to too much of it. kind of a proto science fiction sound. You know, it's got theremins and very influential composer. I don't know if there's any other composer that really thought about the orchestra the way Bernard Herrmann did for the movies, other than maybe Ennio Morricone did a lot of unusual stuff with his film scores. But Day the Earth Stood Still, very influential. It's kind of what we came to expect from science fiction movies. However, the guy who got to the theremin first for this kind of movie was not Bernard Herrmann, but believe it or not, Ferdi Grofé, the guy who wrote the Grand Canyon Suite. He used it in a pretty laughable film called Rocket Ship XM with, I think Lloyd Bridges is in it, actually. Anyway, because of the time considerations, I had to keep moving. I would love to talk about, Bernard Herrmann's such an interesting figure, such an irascible personality. Everybody has a cranky Bernard Herrmann story, and I'd love to talk about that and talk about the trouble he got into with Hitchcock and everything else. But we're just going to move on to the 1950s now. It was an era of great experimentation in film scoring. As with any kind of history, I'm generalizing because there's no one path. The Max Steiner style continued right through the 50s. However, you had people like Alex North in 1951. This is the kind of the seminal jazz score, Streetcar Named Desire. It was the first time that jazz just wasn't something that was a band or something that's happening on screen, but part of the integrated part of the back score or the underscore for the movie. Also, 1955, The Cobweb, a fully 12-tone score. Leonard Rosenman, who did the James Dean classics, Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden, wrote this. He was a student of Arnold Schoenberg, and he brought that to the movies. Forbidden Planet, I put that in there just because it's another strange, no orchestra at all, just all electronic music. Bibi and Louis Barron were avant-garde folks in that field dealing with electronic music and musique concrète. Blackboard Jungle. This one caused riots in the theater. It was the first one to really embrace popular music. And I'm not talking about like Lena Horne or who's the guy I'm thinking of with Harry James or anything like that in the 1940s movies where they come out and play the trumpet or sing a torch song or something like that. This was Rock Around the Clock. And this was kind of the beginning of compilation scores where popular music started to take over from the orchestra, and that continued through the 1960s. Again, this is very simplified. Not everything happened one way. You know, there were still orchestral scores being great orchestral scores. This whole era was the era of the epic. You know, so we had Miklos Rozsa writing these giant biblical scores and historic scores at the same time that all this stuff was going on. In 1970s, early 1970s, Charles Gerhardt, record producer and conductor, he was also, he was mainly known as a record producer, but as a conductor, he had done things for Reader's Digest. They're all very good recordings. He did classical music recordings, he did film music recordings, but he got the green light from RCA that sensed that there was a market for this stuff, because this is the era of Dick Cavett. You know, you'd always have, like I watched Alfred Hitchcock being interviewed by Dick Cavett the other night on YouTube. He'd have Groucho Marx on, he'd have Katharine Hepburn, he'd have, so there's this interest in old movies that weren't even that old at the time, but there was a nostalgia for this stuff, just like with the kids who loved the Bela Lugosi movies and the Marx Brothers and that sort of thing. This was something that was going on. These were all produced by George Korngold, who was the son of Eric Wolfgang Korngold, the guy who did Robin Hood. And they were all bestsellers for RCA. This is only a few of them. I was trying to find somebody with a collection of them on the internet so I could rip the photo. I had to do this at home. These aren't even all of them. But I wanted to, you see these are the Korngold albums. And you got Alfred Newman, Max Steiner, Franz Waxman, kind of an anthology with Golden Age composers for Humphrey Bogart. Dmitri Tiomkin, some of these guys were still alive. Tiomkin was there for the recording session for that, and Miklos Rozsa lived into the 1990s, I think. So, it's a great set if you're interested in this stuff at all. These are the LPs. This is the most recent incarnation. You don't get the cool cover art and the great notes and stuff, but you get the 12 albums in there. Picture of Gerhardt. A lot of these things, these scores were kind of semi-lost. You know, the studios would put these things in a warehouse, and then when they needed room, they would throw them in dumpsters. So some of these had to be reconstructed by ear. There was this guy, Christopher Palmer, who used to take one of those little Panasonic portable cassette players and sit in front of the TV and record the Four Feathers. And he reconstructed Miklos Rozsa's score for the Four Feathers by listening to it again and again and writing out the score. So anyway, this was what was going on in the 70s. So there was kind of a resurgence of that golden age nostalgia, which kind of paved the way. I'm not saying that John Williams went that way because of this. It was just kind of one of these confluences of everything kind of came together. And because Williams was certainly, he had started writing, film and television music in the 50s. So by the 1970s, he had already developed a very expert grasp of the symphony orchestra in all styles. He started out as a jazz musician, actually. So Williams' pedigree. Oh, he studied and worked. John Williams studied and worked with many of the greats. Next time you watch, well, he was the piano player on the pianist on Peter Gunn. Next time you watch The Big Country, he was the pianist on that. He played the piano in West Side Story, the film version. He worked as an orchestrator on Dmitri Tiomkin's The Guns of Navarone. He played the piano on To Kill a Mockingbird. So all these classic films, you realize John Williams has been writing film music or working in the industry for 70 years. So that's like crazy to even consider that. All right, well, there was a big change then. There was like a second golden age that kind of took off in the 70s and went into the 80s where even the worst movies had great scores. I just rewatched Conan the Barbarian the other week. What a score! I thought, oh my God, I don't even like the movie. And I thought, this is like one of the greatest scores. And that's what the 80s were like. And then the 90s. This is Hans Zimmer. This man is more responsible than anyone for kind of the change of the Hollywood sound. And, I'll try to say so in terms that aren't loaded. I don't want to say this man, because I don't have any personal animosity toward Hans Zimmer. He seems like a really nice, pleasant guy, but he totally changed the way the music is made. It's not so, the orchestra is no longer the emphasis, and that's what attracted me. And part of the reason is because of the computer software and the electronics became more sophisticated, and he was really in on the ground floor for harnessing that. And even with the stuff where he incorporates traditional orchestras and musicians, he manipulates it through, what you see here. So it's gotten to the point now where he doesn't really even need very many live musicians if he chooses not to use them. But he had a huge studio of apprentice composers. It was called Media Ventures. So a lot of the composers that are working now came directly out of his kind of school. And then it became Remote Control was the name of the company. So you don't really have to be, and he wasn't really classically trained. You don't have to go to a conservatory anymore. You don't have to study with Gustav Mahler to write a good film score. And not every score has to be John Williams. But that's just kind of, I'm more interested in John Williams, Bernard Herrmann, Erich Wolfgang Korngold. He took it in a different direction, and now you can have members of bands. You can have somebody who's just going around picking up found objects and kind of feeding them, playing them into computers and that sort of thing. And you can come up with a very compelling score. To me, they're not that interesting when they're away from the film. They're good in the movies. They work in the movies. But it'd be nice to, they get a little monotonous for me. So, and it became attractive to the studio bean counters because it was less expensive. You didn't have to hire all the musicians. Because the process, you had to sit down in the old days, the composer would sit down with the director, they'd spot the film, decide where the music had to go. He or she would have to write the music, and mostly he in those days. They'd have to write the music, and then he would have to hand it off to orchestrators who would orchestrate the music. Some of them did it themselves, but it was rare. Then they would be copied by hand. Then they would have the recording session. Then you'd have to record. So you understand, this was like running into time and money. And now, Hans Zimmer comes along and he says, I can get it to you in X amount of days, and people are going to love it. It's exciting music. A lot of these guys came from popular backgrounds, or they had garage bands or that sort of thing. So there's a lot of emphasis on rhythm and percussiveness. You can kind of hear that in some of his scores, that he has more of a popular mentality. So you can almost hear the drummer, and the guy's like working out a simple groove, and there's no counterpoint, and it's just a simpler, although admittedly exciting approach to film scoring. I mean, it's good for workout. If you have a workout tape, you can put Gladiator on, but it becomes over time though. This is 20 years later, Dune, which was just out a couple of years ago. And you can hear he's getting further away from the orchestra. It's not like this for every score, but this is a very characteristic Zimmer score. Oscar winner. Both of these won Oscars. I don't know where to cut in, so I apologize, but we've got limited time. In fact, how much time do we have left here? How are we doing? I'm not even done yet. But so anyway, this is just an example of how he's gotten more away from the orchestra. But, it's an Oscar winner. It's a very interesting score. It works well with the movie. And attractive, as I said, to the people paying the bills. We've gotten further and further away from, I think, experimentation, and certain creative ideas are limited by the risk, because there are billions of dollars on the line every time they release one of these things. The budget's in the millions, but they need to make billions of dollars on these blockbusters. So the emphasis is often on intensity and dystopia. You kind of lose that Korngoldian wide open adventure and romance that really filled my heart as a teenager. It's like, oh, this is so great. Here, it's just like, I survived the movie. I walk out. That's a good movie, but I'm glad I survived. Even the trailers are kind of like a little bit rough. They ratchet up the tension. You have the stingers. You have the mic drop moments in the comedies where somebody will make a joke and then you'll have like kind of the needle scratch and that kind of thing. And popular songs. I saw a trailer for something recently. I don't remember what it was. It was a historical 19th. I don't know if it was a Bronte movie or what it was, but there was some popular song, and it's just. And I understand it's like you can't have an orchestra in every. It makes no sense to have an orchestra in the 17th century, but that's my thing. I guess it's just as out of place to have a 100-piece orchestra back in the days of the Seahawk as it is to have a popular song in the Brontes. Okay, on the other hand, we have Michael Abels. And it's good to have him on here because he's on the next concert of the Princeton Symphony Orchestra. He has a piece coming up called, or they have a piece that they're going to be playing called More Seasons, which is a play on Vivaldi's Four Seasons. But Michael Abels, sound, at least in the orchestral works that I've heard, are more film than his film music. His film music is a little more experimental. He's mainly known for the Jordan Peele movies, Get Out, Us, and Nope. And he is a Pulitzer Prize winner. Last year, he won the Pulitzer Prize for an opera called Omar, which he wrote in collaboration with Rhiannon Giddens. And so he's a respected concert composer who dips his toe into film music. He's not really making a career at film music, but he's made his mark. With Get Out, Jordan Peele said he wanted kind of a black influence in the score, but they didn't want anything like stereotypically voodoo. So he said, what can you come up with? So Abels decided to use a Swahili text, and he kind of put a little bit of a blues bent to the music. So here's just a little bit from Get Out, which is fairly recent. So it is a horror movie. A little bit of shades. I haven't mentioned Jerry Goldsmith at all. I love Jerry Goldsmith, but he didn't make my talk. But he did the music for The Omen. But anyway, so he came up with his own approach to that film, which was very successful. Jordan Peele does psychological horror films. If you haven't seen it, that's Get Out. Okay, but so this is an example, though, of Michael Abels as one of these composers that came up and didn't look down his nose. You used to have to choose between film music and concert music. There was a time when concert music film music was kind of regarded as slumming. Critics were not kind to film music, but now everybody in the orchestras, all the musicians grew up with Star Wars, so they're all like me. They all love John Williams. It's like so now it's not as much of a stigma. There's less snobbery, even though you had major composers either writing film scores back in the old days, not regularly, but Aaron Copland would come out to Hollywood and he'd try his hand and write it. He wrote some excellent scores. Shostakovich in the Soviet Union, Ray Vaughan Williams, William Walton in Britain, Arthur Honegger and Georges Auric in France. A lot of these guys who had reputations as classical composers wrote great scores, but they weren't part of the system. It was a big deal to have them in there. It took longer for them to write the music. Igor Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg both tried to bust into Hollywood because they found the money attractive. Stravinsky tried to, among other movies, he tried to write the music for Song of Bernadette and Jane Eyre, the one with Orson Welles and I think Joan Fontaine. And he just couldn't work that fast. Schoenberg, he said he wanted $50,000 and they said no right off the bat. He was going to write the music for The Good Earth. And they said, no, Schoenberg, go home. So the orchestras now also recognize it's lucrative, the viability of this kind of thing. They're starting to perform, well, they have done it for a while now, performing the scores with the movie being shown. I think it would be great to, I'm probably the only guy who would sit there, but I would love if they did it without the movie. I think it's more interesting to hear what's going on in the orchestra, and I think a lot of people come to see the movie, and they're watching the movie, and the orchestra's just playing in the background. It's kind of like seeing it with the regular soundtrack in the film. So it'd be very interesting, I think, for somebody to if they want to lose some money, they could start a film score orchestra. I'd be happy to be an advisor. So there's a cross-fertilization between the genres. Concert music is getting more like film music, and film music is, has always been picking up things from the concert world. But it is it's a commercial venture because it's tied to the movies. You can only go so far in your invention. And film is a very interesting art because they feel like they know it because it's so accessible. Everybody has an opinion about a movie. It doesn't have to be an informed opinion, but everybody feels like they know what they're talking about with the movies. It's not like looking at a painting or going and hearing a symphony. When they see a movie, they know what they like about it. They know what they don't like about it. Everybody has an opinion. Now, part of the resurrection or the increased respectability of film scores is we have these specialty soundtrack labels. These groups all have revived old scores. Either they re-record them or they find the original recordings and they brush them up and they reissue them. If you're interested in collecting this stuff, these are primo. This used to be the only show in town, Perez Sarabande. These guys, though, I just kicked in they had a Kickstarter for Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and I gave them some money. So we can get Frank Skinner's score recorded. And this Screen Archives is a distributor. They carry all of this stuff, and you can find any film music on those sites. All right, so I want to jump into the fun stuff now. That's kind of my whirlwind history. Why does film music matter? Are film and classical music the same? No, I already hinted at that. I'm not going to go into that. There's a Q&A. If you want to talk more about it, that's fine. Aaron Copland's philosophy was that film music should not really be heard. It should kind of be felt. So he was in favor of not having overbearing scores. He would probably not like some of John Williams' stuff. I don't know. But in film, music is only one of many parts. I mean, you've got the screenwriter, you've got the sound design, you've got, everybody's contributing. You can't be the star all the time. There are times when the music can step out, think of Lawrence of Arabia with those vistas, with the sand dunes and that sort of thing. That requires, some great standout music, but a lot of times it's underscore, it's part of the fabric of the dialogue and everything else. So you have to do what you have to do to come out with a nice finished product that's going to make a lot of money. So I'm going to skip over some of this. But at the same time, though, these composers that are writing for film, more people hear their music than will fill all the concert halls in the world. So if you're in this business to make money, if you break into the film business, you're going to make a lot more money than you are writing symphonies or operas. What do we have here? All right, so on to the next slide. Now, these are some good scenes with music. These are unforgettable, indelible scenes with music. When we talk about, why is music important? Why does it matter? Can you imagine any of these movies without the music? I mean, the shower scene in Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock originally wanted it without the music. Bernard Herrmann put the music in. Hitchcock said, you were right. But it makes it so much more chilling with the music. If you go on YouTube, there's a video with and without the music, and you can see just how tame it is without the music. But in 1960, that was pretty intense stuff. People would leave the theater. Jaws couldn't make the shark work. The less time they had the shark on screen, the more suspenseful it was. The music did all the heavy lifting. So when you see Chrissy there at the beginning of Jaws and you hear the double basses and the shark motif, nobody ever forgot. It's still both of these scores are still being parodied, as is this one, 60 years later, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Ennio Morricone, you know the music, and I don't have to put it up there. So these are things where the music is indelible, works great with the scenes work great with the music. Here's scenes without music. Some of the biggest scenes, the Chariot Race from Ben-Hur. Huge, epic score, Miklos Rozsa. Fabulous score, one of my absolute favorites. No music in the Chariot Race. He has the procession, the charioteers with the music, and he just lets the sequence go. North by Northwest, another great film score by Bernard Herrmann. No music in the crop duster scene. Builds tension just with the sound of the airplane and with Cary Grant, breathlessly running from his assailant, potential assassin. Saving Private Ryan, John Williams, subtle score by John Williams. No music during the Omaha Beach sequence. Powerful, powerful movie making, though. And these are two more. The Birds, there's no music at all in The Birds. Alfred Hitchcock had Bernard Herrmann come in and supervise electronic bird sounds. They used bird calls instead of the music to build tension in that movie. Magnificent Seven, the opposite. This, in my opinion, I mean, I know it's a classic, but it's based on Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, which is a fabulous movie. But he takes his time to build that. Magnificent Seven's a much shorter movie. Great, iconic actors all became stars, but you really don't get to my opinion, you don't get to spend enough time with them. It's the music that makes this movie move. You get Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen on a wagon, and that music plays. You got an exciting movie. And I hope you know the music from the Magnificent Seven. I don't have it on here. We don't have time to play it anyway. Here's just an example. I'm going to play a little bit of this. This is tongue-in-cheek, I think. Everybody's seen Star Wars, right? This is the throne room scene from Star Wars, the big pomp and circumstance march where you've got the Elgarian William Walton sound to it. And it really, is uplifting, and it makes the scene memorable. Somebody put it on there without the music. I have a feeling he had some fun with it, but it's just a short bit. But this is just a taste of what it would be without the music. Well, this is Gustav Holst from The Planets. They just put that in there. So you can really see how music can affect your impression of a movie or a scene. This is my last slide. How much time do we have? Are we getting there? Are we there? So these are I'll just say very quickly, just with my back against the wall, I had to pick 10 scores. So I very quickly just picked these. These are not my all-time favorite scores, but some of my favorites. Ennio Morricone, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The Big Country by Jerome Moross. One of the great Western scores. The opening credits alone, all it is a stagecoach rolling into town, but the music is just so good. E.T. the Extraterrestrial, one of the best endings of any film as far as the music goes. They shut the projector off and just let John Williams do his thing. He didn't even do it with the movie. The Seahawk, we talked about, Ben-Hur. Thief of Baghdad, Miklos Rozsa, a great fantasy score from, I think, 1940. Best Years of Our Lives, terrific score by Hugo Friedhofer. It was orchestrated by Jerome Moross, who did The Big Country, who in turn, Jerome Moross was the orchestrator for Aaron Copland when he did his film scores in Hollywood. Empire Strikes Back, it's second of the, well, I don't know how you count the Star Wars films, but I say the second of the Star Wars movies. The Quiet Man, which is Victor Young. That's based a lot on the Irish folk songs and stuff. I know some people find it stereotyped. They find it quaint. I watch it every year on St. Patrick's Day. I love it. Superman's the only one that I kind of plugged in up here because the opening was just so, even more than Star Wars. It just, I just melted through the chair. It was just such an insane score. But when I listen to the whole 2-record set, it gets to be a little overbearing. But I love it. The helicopter sequence. These are just 10 things, all highly recommended. I could go on a lot more about them. I didn't know how long the talk would run, and I figured if I had to pad, I could talk about any one of these. But I hope that the next time that you watch a movie, especially if it's the second time that you see it, that you pay a little more attention to what's going on with the music, especially in the good films. There's a lot of subtlety. There are a lot of clever things that the composer works out. Sometimes they work with the action. Sometimes they work against the action for a reason. And remember, John Williams may not be Stravinsky, but Stravinsky could not do what John Williams does on a regular basis. and he does so masterfully. Well, thank you for your time. Thanks.